Kwani natoma kanitampaga skatasquamson. I am very honored and blessed this day to be greeting you all. Neesu Wushuwunoag, Director General of the Federation of Aboriginal Nations of the Americas. Wanting to first wish you all a very happy Gregorian New Year. If you are familiar with traditional indigenous culture, then you know that most indigenous cultures celebrate their New Year around April, March, somewhere in that range. When, you know, spring, when everything's fresh and new and all that, which makes sense. But we're living under a colonial system, so happy Gregorian New Year to everyone. I hope that the Gregorian New Year is off to a good start for you all. And today's discussion, I think, is a very pertinent one, one that is you'll find very interesting, hopefully, and will help you a little bit further on your own quest to kind of address what's going on in terms of colonialism and indigenous peoples in their lands. And calling this one 7 key terms for addressing colonialism. And really wanted to focus on this because one of the main things, the main element that colonialism uses is legalese. And if you're familiar with the ancestors, one of the main things that all of them said, or everywhere, was that they felt that the Europeans spoke with a forked tongue. Well, what does that mean? It means that they say one thing and then something else comes about. And then they say, well, that's what we said. And it can be very kind of frustrating trying to understand how they're getting away with it unless you understand that they're using a system of legalese, which is a type of language that they use in court systems and things of that nature. And if you go into court not understanding the legalese, but using common language, you're going to be in a whole heap of trouble. So these are 7 terms, and we're going to go through these terms. And ultimately, with a better understanding of these terms, you should have a better understanding of why FANA moves in the way that it does, why it promotes to other nations to consider moving in the same manner, and ultimately how it protects those rights and all of those things that should be ours as indigenous individuals or nations aboriginal to our specific lands. So there's going to be 7 terms. And the first term I want to start with is the term law. Now, these definitions I'm using, the majority of them are coming out of Black's Law 2nd edition. From my own personal research, my understanding is that editions 1 through 4 are decent, 1 being the best because it's closest to the terminology that they were using when they initially started this. And then when you get to 5 and beyond, they stop pulling terms out and putting other new ones in and that sort of stuff. So these come from Black's Law 2nd edition, and you can just Google this. If you type in any of these terms and type Black's Law after it, a free website should come up that has all of the Black's Law definitions from the 2nd edition. So the first term we're going to look at is law. And you'll find that a lot of these definitions actually have 2 definitions. So here we go with the forked tongue, right? Because when they use these terms, which definition are they using? And if you don't even know that there's multiple definitions, how can you possibly hope to negotiate with them or engage in any sort of contract with them on a solid footing? And this is really what got our ancestors into a lot of trouble. So the first term is law, and the first definition, and I didn't write out the whole definition, so I'm just paraphrasing or pulling out the elements that I thought was important. Please look these up yourself. Don't ever take what anyone says. Make sure to cross-reference. So the first term is law, and the first definition is that which is laid down, ordained, or established. That which is laid down, ordained, or established. So there's the written law, right? There's what's the term? Precedent. There's the precedent law. There's the things that have been written down, what everyone can see and read. And this is the written law, right? So that's one law. But here's the second law. And the second law, and there's some more dots after ordained or established. The second law is a system of principles and rules of human conduct. So the first definition is that which is laid down, ordained, or established, The second definition starts a system of principles and rules of human conduct, So notice, there's a written law, which is laid down, ordained, or established. And then there's a system of principles and rules of human conduct that I'm going to refer to in this particular video as the natural law. So 2 laws, 2 different definitions of law. So 2 ways to look at the law. That which is laid down, ordained, or established, or a system of principles and rules of human conduct. Since we're talking about colonization and colonialism, logic should tell you that when they speak about law, they're speaking about the first one, that which is laid down, ordained, or established, which is why they'll consistently say that, well, indigenous people didn't have any written laws, so therefore their laws prevail. Because they're going by this definition, that which is laid down, ordained, or established, not a system of principles and rules of human conduct. As a matter of fact, in that first definition, if I'm not mistaken, and once again, please double check, I don't think humans in the first part, in the first definition. I don't think the term has nothing to do with being human. It's all about that which is laid down, ordained, or established. So understand that first concept. In the term law, there's more than one definition. And which law are they talking about when you engage with it? So we understand law. Let's look at the second term. And this one's key because we need to understand it because it definitely affects us. This is class. Class. And what's the definition of class? Well, once again, a couple here. Let me read them. The order or rank according to which persons or things are arranged or assorted. So that's the first definition of class. The order or rank according to which persons or things are arranged or assorted. And this is the one that's probably most pertinent, at least to colonization. Also, a group of persons or things taken collectively, having certain qualities in common, and constituting a unit for certain purposes. Let me read that again. Also, a group of persons or things taken collectively, having certain qualities in common, and constituting a unit for certain purposes. So you have a middle class, right? You have a working class. You have a upper class. You have a, all of these sorts of things. You can be classed according to your neighborhood, a suburbanite or an urbanite or a ruralite. I don't even know if that's a real word. But class, people with a common characteristic or quality that they're being lumped together to constitute a unit for certain purposes. Your neighborhood where you live in, the school you go to, public school, private school, all of these different types of class that are going on all around us. And these affect us every single day. So the law, the written, what is laid down, ordained, or established, has different types of class underneath it. The law has different types of class. The established, written, or ordained has different types of class. And we can see it by just the terms I gave you. One particular type of class, and this is going to lead us to term 3, one particular type of class that the law has, especially here under U.S. colonization, I would say European colonization in general, is race. Race. Race is a type of class. So when you look at the census, when they took the census forms on anything, they'll ask you, what's your race? Why? Because they're trying to put you in a particular class. And we're going to get to why, but first let's look at what the definition of race is. And you're going to love this, because once again, more than one, right? So the first definition of race is a tribe, people, or nation belonging. A tribe, people, or nation belonging. But here's the second part. But they actually added into the same definition. So a tribe, people, or nation belonging or supposed to belong to the same stock or lineage. So they either belong to the same stock or lineage, or they're supposed to belong to the same stock or lineage. And then after it has in parentheses, race, color, or previous condition of servitude, according to Constitution, U.S., American, I'm assuming 15. I'm assuming that's Article 15. I'm not sure. But race can be a tribe, people, or nation that belong to the same stock or lineage, or that are supposed to belong to the same stock or lineage. And race, color, or previous condition of servitude can be determinants of race. So we understand what happened with Walter Plecker, Racial Integrity Act, and all that. That's all tying back to this concept of race. But I want to go a little bit deeper on this concept of race, because I want everyone to understand where this particular class is coming from and why it's so prevalent in our society and why it's such a detrimental factor. So we're talking race, right? And I'm going to put the link in the description. But there's race, and then there's scientific racism. So this is when you know, the general sort of consensus around this topic of race is coming, and people are really starting to buy into it from a scientific standpoint. So this is the timeline of scientific racism. Once again, you can check the link. It's from the NYU page, nyu.edu. I'll put it in the description. But the timeline starts in 1759 with a gentleman by the name of Colonization, who, by the way, was a botanist dealing with plants. So Colonization, a botanist, publishes the 10th edition Systema Naturalis. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, but 10th edition Natural. And in this 10th edition Systema Natural, he proposes that there are 4 races of men. So a botanist proposes that there are 4 races of men. Now, I'll let you go and look up what those particular races are. I'm not going to spend too much time on it right now, because I want to point to the fact that while in 1759, Linnaeus, a botanist, is saying that there's 4 races of men, in 1795, less than 40 years later, Johann Friedrich proposes that there's actually 5 races of men. So within less than 40 years, we can see that this concept of race has now evolved from 4 to 5, which should tell you that there isn't any sound understanding or footing underneath it. It's more of a theory that, as you can see, is evolving, and you'll see as we go on why I'm using that particular terminology. So 1759, 4 races by Carl Linnaeus. 1795, 5 races by Johann Friedrich. 1844, Robert Chambers publishes The Vestiges of Natural History of Mankind. And there's tons of other dates in between these. I'm just pulling out what I thought was some of the more pertinent ones. But please go look up this page and familiarize yourself with this this timeline. So 1844, Robert Chambers publishes Vestiges of the Natural History of Mankind. And this is when he proposes that race is actually tied to stage of evolution. And of course, the white race being the most superior and highly evolved of all the races. So it jumps from 4 to 5. Now it's being proposed that it's actually tied to evolution. Evolution is basically shown through race. And the white race is the most evolved of all the races. Let's jump ahead to 1910. And we all hear about this thing called eugenics. We're familiar with it, so I won't go into too much. But in 1910, the Eugenics Record Office is opened in Davenport. And this is, you know, it's gotten enough support from the masses of the scientific community to start being needing an actual records office, somewhere official, so that they can kind of go more into this. 1911, Franz Boas publishes The Mind of Primitive Man. And here, oh, I'm sorry, hold on. We need to go back. We need to reverse. 1844, Robert Chambers publishes The Vestiges of Natural History of Mankind, equating race with stages of evolution, and of course, the white race being the most evolved. Well, here comes along 1859, good old Charles Darwin with On the Origin of Species, where he's promoting what? Evolution as the theory of how life started. So you have this theory of race that comes up in 1759. There's 4 races. 100 years later, The Origin of Species comes out promoting evolution, which is only 15 years after Robert Chambers equates race to stages of evolution. So you can see slowly over time how these theories are once again evolving, but they most certainly are based in this notion of race, racial inferiority, and racial superiority. So you have to tie that in when you're considering Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species in 1859. So we talked about 1910, we talked about 1911, Franz Boas, The Mind of Primitive Man, where he equates environment with the causes of race. So we've already established that race equals stage of evolution. We've already established that evolution is how the life got started, right? So therefore, obviously, the white man, white, is the most evolved, because if evolution is how we got started, and if race is equated to evolution, and if the white race is the most evolved, then clearly they're the most superior based upon what science says. And now we're going to actually take it further, and we're going to equate race to environment. So not only are the different stages of race tied to the level of evolution, but warmer climates probably are the most unevolved. So people who come from the warmest climates, who are probably going to have the darkest skin, right? Africa, Central and South America, they're going to be the least evolved. The least evolved. So Franz Boas is pushing that environment causes race. And once again, I'm going to keep saying that this race thing is tied to evolution, which is all tied to concepts of racial inferiority and superiority, because remember in 1910, the Eugenics Record Office opens. Well, in 1912, the first International Eugenics Council is held in London, England, and is presided over by Charles Darwin. So clearly we can see Charles Darwin was subscribing to the eugenics notion. Clearly we can see that just 15 years before, this notion that race is tied to evolution comes out. I think we can logically make the assumption and assertion that Darwin's theory of evolution was tied to concepts of racial inferiority and superiority, which is why he's presiding over the first International Eugenics Council in London, England in 1912. 1916, we have Madison Grant, and this is how you just know that the theory is just not holding much water. Madison Grant publishes The Passing of the Great Race, in which he argues that there are actually three races in Europe: the Nordics, the Alpines, and the Mediterraneans. So even within Europeans, where the majority of quote-unquote white people are coming from, there's racial divisions there. So clearly there's more than 5 races. Now it would seem there's at least 7 to 8. 7 to 8 separate races, all within the scope of less than 200 years. 4 races to 7 to 8 races in the scope of 200 years. Now, this is all around this eugenics stuff. What does society eventually decide about eugenics? In 1935, the Carnegie Institute publishes an executive summary, I believe, just basically saying that eugenics is unsatisfactory for science. It's not something that should be considered scientific, which should tell you then that this race and this evolution elements should also be considered non-viable for science, because they're all based in this notion of racial inferiority and superiority, which is where the theory of evolution is kind of finding its footing and growth. And then in 1998, the American Anthropology Society states that contemporary science makes clear that human populations are not unambiguous, clearly demarcated, biologically distinct groups. So in essence, the concept of race is a fabrication. And remember 1759, what's going on in 1759 to 1795? Well, you have the American Revolution going on, right? You have upheaval all around the world pretty much. Wars and all that. And this is a way to continue to promote a certain concept that's going to allow individuals coming from Europe to kind of, once again, formulate around a ideology that they're proposing. The white race, they're supposed to belong to the same stock or lineage, and then utilize that particular racial classification to put themselves in a superior ranking or order. Because remember, class is the order or ranking. The order or ranking is the grouping together, but it's also the order or ranking. And we know from the beginning of the U.S. that white was going to be in a superior status to black. All of these other classifications that are going on. So ultimately, race is a tribe, people, or nation belonging to the same stock or lineage, or a tribe, people, or nation supposed to belong to the same stock or lineage. And it can be attributed to race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So when we look at servitude, and it's particularly in terms of the number of Indians that were forced into servitude, we can see how a lot of those Indians ended up being classified racially as Negro, Black, African American, colored, whatever the case may have you. So let's recap. We started off with the law, that which is laid down, ordained, or established. The second definition, a system of principles and rules of human conduct. But we're not discussing the second principle yet. We're discussing the first one, that which is laid down, ordained, or established. We understand that under the law there are different types of class, which is the order or rank according to which persons or things are arranged or assorted. But it's also defined as a group of persons or things taken collectively having certain qualities in common and constituting a unit for certain purposes. And then one type of class is race, racial class. So you have middle class, economic class, you have racial class, you probably have religious class, gender, all of these different classes. But race is one of the most pertinent and most effective tools of colonization because it's defined as a tribe, people, or nation who are supposed to belong to the same stock. So you don't even have to actually, you can just come together, as has been done with the white race, as we see with the black race, with the Asian race, with all of these different races that they put forward, as if they're all some sort of homogenous, amalgamated group. And they're not. They're not. Race is a concept that was promoted as a tool to promote white supremacy and to instill in the minds that individuals who are not considered quote-unquote white are inferior. And it's a great tool for colonization. So we've done 3 terms so far out of 7. Law, class, and race, right? So once you get your racial classification, that racial classification is going to give you a certain status. And what status? Well, the status is the status of a person is his legal position or condition, ... Once again, go look up the information. Google it. The status of a person is his legal position or condition, ... The term is chiefly applied to persons under disability or sons who have some peculiar condition which prevents the general law from applying to them in the same way as it does to an ordinary person. And notice I said sons because for some reason that's how it's written in there. And I'm going to suggest that others look into it as well. But it's written in there for some reason, like that. But status is the legal position or condition. So once you get into a racial classification, you're going to go into different statuses, right? So you might have, let's start with black. You've got your African immigrants, right? Quote-unquote African immigrants or nationals. Nigerian national, Liberian national, right? Then you might have someone who becomes a citizen, Liberian American, right? Then you might have someone who's here illegally. You know what I'm saying? Then you might have what we call the black or the colored or the African American. All of these underneath this black, all of them with different statuses in the law, different ways to engage with it. A Nigerian American is probably going to have a better go in the law than a Nigerian national who's not here legally, as they say. So there's going to be different statuses. Same thing with the American Indian racial classification, different statuses. And we've gone over this before. I'll just shoot over it again. Here at FANA, in our research, we found at least 5. That is, first, your federally recognized Native Americans. Secondly, your state-recognized Native Americans. Thirdly, your urban Indians, and they could be federally or state-recognized, but they're living in urban areas. Fourth, you have your unidentified or misclassified, and these individuals, a lot of them are going to be in the black category. Maybe some of them are in the Asian. A bunch of them are going to be in the white category, because remember, families were marrying. You know, it was considered at one time, especially after racial integrity, better to be considered white than not white. So Indians were marrying in. In the Northeast, they called it passing, where if you could pass for white, you pass for white, you got better jobs, better opportunities. Maybe you married into white families, all of that. But a lot of them are actually Indians who are claiming to be white, black, any other thing, Latinos. They're actually Indians in terms of racial classification. And so you're unidentified or misclassified. And then lastly, you have the space that FANA has been navigating. Your Indians not taxed. And this is, per our communication with federal authorities, tribes that are separate foreign nations from the U.S. and are recognized in treaties and things of that nature. Those are Indians not taxed. And that's the space that we've been moving in. And that, of course, comes through our utilization of the trust, of the tribal trust. It provides that clear commercial separation to show that our tribal citizens are foreign to the U.S. So that's where the tribal trust comes in. Now, I want to make sure people understand that this racial classification and the status therein isn't about phenotype. It's simply about what your relationship is with this system, because I've been seeing a lot of conversation online saying that the tribes out west are quote-unquote Mongoloid, and we don't subscribe to any of those notions or terminologies at FANA. There are no Mongoloid tribes, there are no Negroid tribes, there are not no Euro tribes, there are Indian tribes by blood. So it's incorrect to say that the tribes out west are Native Americans because they're Mongoloid. That's not true at all. There are tribes here in the east that are federally recognized Native Americans. And the Native American comes from being federally recognized, from the relationship you have. So we have to stop, once again, looking at the history of race, trying to associate racial phenotypes with statuses, particularly of American Indian. There's nothing more than a commercial relationship and contractual relationship that your nation either does or does not have with the U.S., and also how your nation is operating commercially. Is your nation even operating commercially? And if so, how so? So these statuses give a person their legal position or condition. But the term is chiefly applied to persons under disability or per-sons who have some peculiar condition which prevents the general law from applying to them in the same way as it does to an ordinary person. So this is where the whole concept of the 14th Amendment citizen is going to come in. And I'm going to tell you right now, from our understanding, unless you're some sort of diplomat, you know, of course, the national, but if you're here by any sort of lawful status with the U.S., unless you're an Indian not taxed, your status is going to be inferior to the U.S. You're going to be a citizen of them, a subject of them. You're going to be considered under disability with a peculiar condition that prevents the general law from applying to you in the same way as it does an ordinary person. This is most certainly where people classified as black are at, which is why they don't get any human rights, which is why it doesn't make any sense to argue why isn't the UN coming in or why other nations coming in. Your status is considered almost on a disability. You can't speak on behalf of your own. You're subject to your sovereign, which is the U.S. So your racial classification, your class, but your racial classification is going to give you a certain status in the society under the law, whether they're saying it or not, based upon what is laid down, ordained, or established. Your status, which is your legal position or condition, is going to be based upon, particularly in a colonial system, your racial classification and how that applies based upon what is laid down, ordained, or established. So once you understand how status works and how it's impacted by racial classification, the next term you want to look at, and this is term number 5, is jurisdiction. And what is jurisdiction? Well, once again, and ... at the end, the power or authority constitutionally conferred upon ... a court or judge to pronounce the sentence of the law or to award the remedy provided by law. But ultimately, it's power or authority. That's what jurisdiction is. So the basic way to look at it is, if you live in a city, the cop from the town over can't come to your town or your city trying to arrest you. They don't have jurisdiction in that space. They don't have any lawful authority to do that. Their jurisdiction ends where the boundaries of your town or city begins. They can't cross those boundaries or else they'll be in violation of color of law. So jurisdiction is a very key concept. That's just a general overview. Definitely look more into it if you're unfamiliar with it. But jurisdiction is power or authority. And if you are a 14th Amendment U.S. citizen under some subject relationship, federally recognized, state recognized, whatever the case may be, if you're in a subject relationship, then the U.S. is going to have jurisdiction over you to some extent. Here in these lands, they're going to have some sort of jurisdiction based upon what's laid down, ordained, or established. Never mind the human aspect, never mind any of that, based upon what's written down about you. And once again, if there's nothing written down about you, then it's going to be supposed what racial classification you belong to. So if you look a certain way, if we subscribe to this racial phenotype thing, and you look a certain way, then it's going to be assumed that you're part of a certain racial classification, whether you actually are or not if you subscribe to this notion of race. And that's then going to affect your status, which is going to impact your jurisdiction, or the jurisdiction that other entities that might be foreign to you actually can claim over you. Now, why is jurisdiction important? Well, because if the U.S. has jurisdiction over you, then you, federally recognized Native American tribe, cannot go and argue treaty rights because you don't have, and this is the sixth term, standing. And what is standing? Well, standing is a right of people to challenge the conduct of another person in a court. So when you see the federal government running pipelines through your land, and you go into court arguing treaty rights, you don't have the standing because of your racial classification and the status that you have with it, which gives the U.S. jurisdiction. If you federally recognize, you've placed your lands in a federal trust, the feds have jurisdiction over them. So you cannot argue now that after allowing your lands to be put in a federal trust, that your treaty rights say they can't do this. You've given them jurisdiction over your lands. You don't have the standing because you're now classified as a domestic dependent nation. You don't have the standing under law. Under law, under what is written down, laid down, ordained, or established, you don't have the standing to argue treaty rights. So they're going to kick your court case out of court based upon the fact that you don't have any standing. And of course, if you don't have any standing, then how can you argue to protect the last term we're going to look at tonight, your rights? And what are rights? An entitlement to something. So, and there are all sorts of rights. There are legal rights, civil rights, human rights, indigenous rights, women's rights, and the list goes on and on and on. All of these sorts of rights, but remember, the rights that we're looking for are the ones that are tied to the natural law, the system of principles and rules of human conduct, often called the common law. I'm just calling it the natural law. I'm sure there's more appropriate definitions. I'm just calling it the natural law. That's really the rights we want to get to. But until we understand, first of all, which law system we're dealing with, is it the system of principles and rules of human conduct with colonization? Most certainly not. They didn't look at indigenous people as humans. They looked at them as savages. Savages, which is why they were doing what they were doing. And how did they do it? According to that which is laid down, ordained, or established, and that was international law, commercial international law. They then gave all of these different classes to individuals over here based upon their racial phenotypical looks. So if you were too dark-skinned in encomienda, blanqueamiento, if you were too dark-skinned, you were negro. If you were light-skinned, then you could be, a mulatto or a mestizo or a coyote based upon your features. But all of this decimated families because within the same family, you might have 3 or 4 different racial classifications going on, and all given a different status, a different position of standing in the law. And then because they were all classified as not human, but under these class of subjugation to these colonial powers, they then conferred that they had jurisdiction over these people to do with them what they wanted. And the people, being that they were considered savages, inhuman, non-Christians, whatever the case, whatever terminology they wanted to use to subjugate, it was Christianity. Who knows if some other religion had gotten here first, what they would have did it under. But it was all colonization, and these are all tools. So all of this is going to be used to snatch away any right you have or any standing that you have to argue against them because you're a Negro. If you're in the islands, you're not a Taino anymore, you're a Negro. And you came here from Africa. So you're an immigrant now as well. Your class is immigrant. You're not even from these lands. Therefore, you're in an inferior status to me because you came here as a slave. And therefore, you don't have any standing to argue against anything that I'm doing. Therefore, you can't protect your rights. Legalese, it's so important because it's how they're beating us. This is all contracts and all obligations that they're asserting that we have with them. And we have to know how to properly address it. And we can't get to the second definition of the law, system of principles, rules, and human conduct, until we first understand the system of law that they're utilizing, how it impacts us, and ultimately why misclassification is one of the key elements of colonization and one of the most pertinent issues that we need to address. And hopefully this also explains a little bit further why gets you to see that this is all a paperwork sort of thing. They didn't take the land first by just coming and killing. They came first by edicts and decrees, things that were laid down, ordained, or established. And because we have not known how to address them appropriately, we have not been able to properly rebut any of them. And this is a concept that was shared with me by a colleague and mentor that I had met. We were having conversations about the challenges that indigenous people were facing. And she said, when you're looking at the law, you have to understand the law is not necessarily right or wrong, moral or ethical. It's simply what has been agreed to at the moment. What has been agreed to at the moment. That which is laid down, ordained, or established. And until we get a full comprehension on what's laid down, ordained, or established, and how that impacts us, and correct it in their system, they're going to continue to suppose that we belong to a certain stock or lineage, which then allows them to classify us racially. And especially if the supposed stock or lineage is coming from Negro or whatever these terms that they want to use, which they associate with a previous condition of servitude. Of course, they're going to put you right in there because then that allows them to treat you in a certain status. And I think that we can see clearly what's going on around in terms of violations of all people's rights, but continuously in communities, quote-unquote, of color, with quote-unquote minorities. See, all of these classes, which convey status as a minority, person of color, all of these things, non-white things, which are going to give you a class or order or rank in this colonial system, which confers jurisdiction, which takes away standing, which ultimately impacts your rights. Legalese. Google terms and just write Black's Law after. See what's going on. We also use Ballantyne's. There's several different law dictionaries. You know, familiarize yourself with these terms so that you can understand how to best protect yourself in it. And as we always say at FANA, what we found is that the best way is to find out who you are, find that blood heritage to the lands that predates all of this colonial nonsense, organize yourselves properly and traditionally, and then establish yourselves commercially, appropriately. That's the manner in which you're able to address this colonial system in an effective manner, at the very least from what we've found. Hoping that this is a little bit longer one. I guess we'll do a longer one to start the new Gregorian year off. Hoping that that was informative and has perhaps opened your mind to a few different things that you didn't understand before. And as always, thank you for listening to us. And on behalf of the Federation of Aboriginal Nations of the Americas, we look forward to connecting with you all soon. I hope.